Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this fifth session, sorry, of the Leeds and Rio Bridge seminars. We are very happy to have today Professor Carlos Pinkusfeld and Professor Andrew Mearman from Leeds and UFRJ. And I think I'll head to Gabriel to present properly our speakers, and I hope we have a nice session today. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Andrew, for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, Norberto. I reiterate the thanks to our two discussants for the day, Andrew Mearman from Leeds University Business School, and Carlos Pinkusfeld from the Institute of Economics of the Rio de Janeiro Federal University. Both of them very kindly accepted to participate in today's discussion around the question, which is, does the history of economic thought evolve similarly across countries? It's a very open-ended questions, and I, for one, am very much interested to listen to their thoughts. So without much further ado, I'd just like to hand over to Andrew, and who we agreed could share his initial ideas about the question. Carlos Pinkusfeld will follow afterwards, both of them with about 15 minutes for initial thoughts, and then we will proceed with the Q&As and their eventual rejoinders. So please, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and yeah, once again, thanks. Well, let me reply by thank you for the invitation. It's really good to be able to support this initiative. I do have a cold today, so I'm actually not breathing very easily. So this means I'm even more keen not to speak too much. So hopefully that people in the audience will take that as an absolutely very strong green light to say as much as they want once we open things up. Anyway, so we've got this question that we've been invited to discuss. Does the history of economic thought evolve similarly in different countries? And I will go on try and answer that question in a very sort of very quick and superficial way, introductory way. But before that, I wanted to sort of think about some of the words in the question, break it down, hopefully in ways that are somewhat helpful. So obviously one way of interpreting the question is to think about history of economic thought as a sort of academic subject or discipline. And this is something that I've taught and tried to embed in all of my teaching. But I'm not really going to focus on that. So I'm not mainly talking about history of economic thought as a subject taught in economics programs. Obviously, though, it does connect to some of the things that I'm going to say. I'm focusing more on history of economic ideas as a larger body, and just thought it might be useful to ask the question: how might we think about that? So I'm going to start by citing a playwright, a Leeds-born playwright called Alan Bennett. And he wrote that history. So he asking the question, what is history? And his answer was that history is, and please excuse the foul language, history is just one fucking thing after another. So just one thing after another. So, and this is still a quite widely held view, that history is just events, things, happenings, all laid out in succession, and therefore the job of the historian is to just describe these objectively and accurately as they can. Doesn't necessarily imply that event X has caused event Y, merely that Y follows X and precedes Z. So history is one thing after another is one way of thinking about history. So for a history of ideas, then, what would we be doing? We'd be identifying key ideas, who thought of them, where they were disseminated, who then adopted them, how they were adapted, how they were changed, etc. Indeed, and I didn't say I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'll go straight back to that. If we think about the way history of thought is taught and embedded in curricula, it's done in this way in many ways. It's taught and communicated in that way. So we, Smith wrote this. Malthus and Ricardo argued about these things. Mill tried to clarify and codify what I've gone before. Marx described all of that as vulgar economics. Keynes came along and then it was reinterpreted, and then people say that wasn't a proper interpretation, etc. So it's really just a kind of, these are things that happened, things that were said, things that were done by people in certain places at certain times. So that's one sort of view of history. And obviously, I think there's still an element of that you can't escape when thinking about the history of ideas. And what I've said so far is consistent with a claim that there might be one true history of economic ideas, a sort of single account which lays out objectively how ideas change or have changed. And again, going back to the thing I wasn't going to talk about, there might be an official account of the history of ideas that is somehow embedded in the training courses that economics students do. And such an official account might seek to claim that indeed economic thought has evolved. I go back to another one of the words in the question. Now, what might this mean? It might just mean that it's changed, right? Some people use it, evolved, as a synonym for change. Or they might use it in a more sort of biologistic way and claim that there are processes of mutation, adaptation, and selection, and describe these processes that led us to the current state of affairs. And this account might even claim that such change, evolution, is progress, development, improvement. It might acknowledge that the history of ideas isn't a linear thing, but it might still assert that cutting through the chaos of the different ideas and events that are going on, there is some sort of clear lineage. And economists do seem to love to claim descent from Adam Smith. And because he said so many things, often contradictory, most of us can do that, but depending on our purpose. So you'll have noticed that I've gone from merely laying out events and ideas to the idea that histories have got narratives that fit particular worldviews. In the 1960s, 1961 to be exact, the British historian E.H. Carr answered his own question, again, what is history, by rejecting the kind of objective interpretations that I've talked about so far, in favour of a view that history reflects a historian's theoretical entry points, that observations are not neutral, and also Carr notes the role of power, history being written by the winners. So if we take this on board, then we might reject the idea there is any such thing as the history of economic thought. That it depends who you ask, their presuppositions, and further that one's experience of the events and the ideas might be quite different. Where one historian sees progress and the eventual triumph of good economics, others may see the promotion of ideas that are merely popular or serve particular interests. In a forthcoming paper based on a book of interviews that we conducted a few years ago, Daniele Guizzo, Sebastian Berger, and I tried to identify what heterodox economics is. And one of the key shared concerns of our interviewees is power. Insufficient attention is being paid to it, and that economists are ignorant of the role of their own power in shaping the discipline. So clearly, heterodox economists might see a very different history, or at least a very different side of that history, to somebody that's perhaps more comfortable in the mainstream. Okay, so George Stigler in 1946 said, "It's distressing how often one can guess the answer given to an economic question merely by knowing who asks it." So you can decide whether you think I confirm Stigler's view or not. My view is that changing the history of economic thought, it's a complex object. It includes multiple, sometimes competing ideas and their producers and institutions where they act. These ideas and actors, agents, interact with various processes within a variety of structures and cultures, some of which are located mainly inside economics, some of which are mainly outside economics. And I'm using inside and outside. Heuristically, there are obviously the boundaries between the two are very much blurred. So if we take that on board, we might observe that global academic economics is still dominated by US institutions and thinkers, and that reflects the power of the USA in some way. Just as at the turn of the 20th century, British and by extension scholars based in the former empire, the Commonwealth, that British influence dominated over things. The Maori educationalist Linda Tuwai-Smith recently asked, if you decolonise UK higher education, what would you have left? And it's a good question. And if you think about it in terms of the ways in which British higher education thinks, but also the physical infrastructure, a lot of the universities in the UK clearly got this imperial legacy and obviously in some cases a legacy of slavery and other things. So if you strip all of that away, what would be left of UK higher education? Well, nowadays, obviously, one answer would be that the cultural mores of US economics and US economics, so the discipline, but also the nature of the economy, would be what's left. That they play a really key role in shaping practices in the UK and in other places. Okay, so these cultural mores and the power structures that are related to these are very important drivers of what happens in UK economics and other places. Now, Tony Lawson, 20 years ago now, in his book Reorienting Economics, argued in one of his chapters that there was a general cultural preference for mathematics, and that this was a key driver in the transformation of economics, so that the mathematization of economics didn't just happen in isolation. And we can connect this as well to the economists' continual desire to prove John Stuart Mill wrong and show that we are, after all, scientists. But I think, not to be too hard on Lawson, but people have argued, and I agree, that Lawson perhaps misses the role of actual economic relations in driving or supporting these cultural shifts. So the methodological individualism already present in economics has been given a real cultural and political boost by the hyper-individualism of global northern societies. And in economics, this offers tacit and perhaps not so tacit support for the psychologistic approaches to economics that have become much more important in the last 30 years or so. A second example would be, or a third example actually, is that a core belief in economics is that markets basically work, and that this belief has been bolstered by the cultural norms around the virtues of marketization, which we hear often. And of course, that's not a one-way thing. The economics helped to create this view of marketization, for instance, via influential groups like the Mont Pelerin Society, as documented by Philip Morawski. So these are a few examples of how these sort of dominant structures and cultural norms from outside the discipline largely have certainly helped support things that were already there and amplify those things, perhaps to the detriment of other things, or perhaps to the exclusion of other things. And there are a few examples. You've probably got lots more. I'd be interested to hear what you think those are. Okay, so I did say I was going to try and answer the whole question, so I'm eventually getting to that now. does the history of economic thought evolve similarly in different countries? So I think much of what I've said obviously clearly implies that yes, it does. The history of economic ideas in the UK reflects a lot the history of US ideas, because there is that relation of dominance between those two countries, and that both in turn affect what economic ideas are deemed good, and therefore what is practiced in other countries. So to some extent, yes, there's a lot of similarity across these the evolution of the ideas, at least in big terms, not necessarily focused on exact events, but the kind of things that are driving those events. There's a lot of similarity, simply because of the nature of the discipline and the nature of the world around the discipline. But having said that, I think the answer is also no. It's not clearly the case that changes in economic ideas in different countries are the same. They're often not the same, and in some cases they can be quite different. And obviously institutional arrangements in different countries do make a difference. So in the UK, for instance, one particular institutional arrangement that's been very important is the research excellence framework, which has had really obvious effects on the structure of economics, not least in encouraging economists out of economics departments and into business schools and other places. Because what's happened here is that economists have kind of shot themselves in the foot. They've downgraded good work because it's not published in the top, i.e. US outlets, even though they must know that these outlets are quasi-closed shops and they're only really open to a fairly narrow set of these US scholars. Another consequence of so they've downgraded their own work, which actually led them to getting less money than they would have done otherwise. So this is sort of perverse outcome, but it's very much a symptom of this particular institutional arrangement, but also reflects that wider set of power structures. But it does show that local arrangements do make a difference. Now, Carlos can comment, and many of you can comment a lot more authoritatively than me on Brazil. But another recent article that Danielle, Sebastian, and I published, we argued that Brazil's distinctive mandated pluralist economics curriculum, which was, as you'll know, established in particular set of circumstances in the 80s, we argue it's actually under threat. It's under threat by pressures on Brazilian scholars and institutions to do internationally recognized work. So there's a clear case here. There are two sides of the story here. There's a clear case where Brazil did something very different because of a particular local context. But the more recent story is that perhaps this is somewhat under threat. The pressure on scholars and institutions to do this internationally recognized work, which of course isn't a bad thing in itself. It's, many people would say it's a laudable goal. But the danger with it is it invites the imposition of these global standards, and thereby leading to a profound change in what's taught and also what kind of work is done in Brazil. So to summarize, and again, this is very much a sketch, does the history of economic thought evolve this similarly in different countries? Well, yes, but also no.
Cheers, Andrew.
Brilliant,
Thank you.
Andrew. Brilliant. There's a lot to unpack there, but thank you very much. These are very well thought ideas around the questions. I'd like to hand over the floor to Carlos now for his thoughts, please.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Andrew. I have to say we have like this pre-meeting that we're going to say yes and no. Yes and no answer. I would say there's a qualified yes, but my position here is to try to present this qualified yes or yes and no from the periphery perspective. So periphery perspective, Latin America and Brazil ideas. So my presentation would like to concentrate on how, of course, our ideas and interpretations, they are in line and they were contemporary to the the main international theoretical trends. That's we say we all, in fact, not just the ideas. Our economy is not very different in terms of tendencies to Latin American or to peripheral countries. We have like periods of fast growth, who has high inflation when we had the 1980s crisis, then we have stabilization when the capital flows came back to the periphery. So we're not that different. Because we are big and we speak Portuguese, which is a strange language, we used to think ourselves as very different, but we're not that different. We just more or less like Latin Americans, sometimes more dramatic problems because we have a bigger country with very unequal country, but it's not that different. And our ideas, they are very much like, or they're in line, as I mentioned, with the theoretical trends, but we have some specificities that I try to address here in my intervention. Of course, I will try to present this direct connection with non-orthodox marginalist ideas. There are some reasons for this. The first, because it seems to me that, as Andrew mentioned, for several reasons, the role that heterodox ideas, heterodox theory, and heterodox economies they occupy in Brazil, they are still relevant. They try to make less relevant they used to be, but we keep fighting. And that maybe there are a lot of reasons for that. So that's my first point why I try to stress the importance of heterodox ideas, is because they are more relevant, I guess, at least in academic terms in Brazil than maybe in other countries. A second one is because, of course, not just academic precision. You have like interaction between heterodox economists and policymaking. So we see we didn't destroy our state in terms of policies. So you still have a development bank, which strangely has a lot of people that don't believe in development, because the vast majority of economists are very much conventional. But at least when they change the direction, those directors, they still believe in public policy and industrial policy. So, and they have to bring back these ideas, orthodox ideas. So we still have sort of institutions of a developmental state that we have stronger, but there's still some places when you can find these ideas. And third, because of course I'm a heterodox author and I work at UFRJ, which is predominantly heterodox university. So, and there are another schools in Brazil that still follow this tradition. So I think I'm justified to follow this and not concentrate in any, because, and also because I don't think that I'm just saying, how to say lugar de fala in English? This is an expression for this place. Is there this? Of course, this expression is in English. We just copy that, but I don't know if there is, because in Portuguese we have the expression. Anyway, as I can talk about
position of speech.
Position of speech. Yeah, I don't have the position of speech to talk about orthodox, but I think they're much more conventional in the sense that they just follow something that is in the fashionable, the most updated ideas or theories. So I don't think they would even be very happy to say they have like original ideas. They just want to be the same wagon that the conventional thought is being developed. They call this the frontier of the idea. So they want to be very far from it. So I think the heterodox are more prone to be trying to be original, at least. Anyway, so I will try to make a short history of economic history, just putting things together, not a history like, and I try to follow this idea that history just put things together in a temporal order, maybe. So the first thing is, I just presented this paper. Now we're going to present again. I wrote with Bruno, who's here, Bruno Pereira. I tried to identify some originality of Brazilian, not Latin American structuralism with respect to the classical development theory, which is, of course, they share a lot of stuff. They share the idea of dualism in the labor market, disguised unemployment, the concept of structural heterogeneity. But I think that Latin American structuralism was emphasized much more the problem of external constraint. And now it's interesting because, just a footnote, because probably Prebisch got these ideas from what's the name, the multiplier, the external multiplier, from that wrote this paper. And I forgot the name of a book, a very complicated book on external constraint that was written in 30s in Cambridge. So there is this cross-pollination from the ideas that it was not that original from Prebisch to emphasize the external constraint. But anyway, but more than just emphasize the external constraint, I think that Latin American structuralism put this in a perspective of geoeconomic and geopolitical world order. That's something that also is present on this long-term theories of Wallerstein, something like that. So maybe we are original in that. I'm not saying that. But anyway, you have this tradition to try to see the country, to understand the country within the tradition, a world view tradition or a world systemic tradition. And now we have, again, the discussion. It's very funny. Things come around again with this growth of the varieties of capitalism, and people try to stress from endogenous variety of capitalism and the systemic variety of capitalism that depends on the organization of world economy. So that's interesting. Well, anyway, I think that's a contribution of Latin American structuralism to emphasize the importance of the political and geopolitical order, economic order, to understand the external constraint. Of course, because you have, it's not just commercial, the most important one is financial. So I think they were right. So another contribution that I mentioned too is the structuralist theory of inflation, approach to inflation. That's funny because the name structuralism was based on the structuralist theory of inflation. So the origin of the term is the theory of inflation. That also has kind of an author that worked with Hicks and Oxford, Julio Oliveira from Argentina, that has a model of flex and fixed prices, but this just more conventional model was not the one that became more famous in the so-called structuralist model of inflation. And this model is much more related to structural heterogeneity, word awful for Brazilians to speak. Yes, it's and so you have sectors, you have limitations of supply, you have problems of supply, and the supply limitations, supply constraints, they generate increase of price. So it's something original, and there are several limitations, but it was an alternative, Latin American alternative for the conventional approach, that the so-called monetarist conventional approach. There's an important policy role in the 60s and the 70s, and it was inside the tradition of cost-push inflation models, and that we that work on this, we consider our fathers, our parents, that we have more recent distributive conflict models that I developed in my thesis, and several economists, academics in Brazil developed. So we can trace this tradition from the first structuralist models that supply constraints somehow to cost push models and modern distributive constraint conflict models that, of course, as I mentioned, it's not, I didn't invent. I use, for example, because they are in English, some articles that are written by Stirati. You have, I will mention also models of the so-called monetary theory of inflation. Anyway, they are not original, but they are, we are working on this theory integrated with the heterodox tradition of the world. And you have like probably some things that are important. Another tradition that heterodox CEPALs absorbed to the center, but we developed to our conditions, is the Caldorian theory of Keynesian distribution of theory, and the problem force savings hypothesis. The force saving hypothesis was very important, and not just for the traditional heterodox economists, but for example, Lance Taylor, which someone that became associated to periphery in terms of thought, and he stressed a lot of this problem of forced savings. I think that we're talking about 60s, and by the end of the 60s, late 60s, we have something that was crucial for us, for the periphery, that was the incorporation of Kalecki's ideas and effect demand theory to the heterodox thinking in Brazil and some places in Latin America. This is a crucial point, a breakthrough, that after that, the vast majority of heterodox economists in Brazil, they are all not all, but anyway, but effective demand short term, no long term, but they're against Seth's law, or they criticize the marginalist theory of equilibrium of full employment. So that's very important, and it was, in political terms, very, very important, because it opposed stagnation theories, which has some serious political consequences. We can talk about that for youngsters and not Brazilians. So it was something important, and that it gave an explanation for the economic miracle that was not conventional. And there was heterodox and say, no, they are doing what we, in terms of course, the demand we would do. So they are being, in this sense, heterodox in their policies. And also, I want just to mention that at this time too, there were the dependency theories, and there is a Marxist dependency theory, which I just mentioned. I will not delve on it. And there was a much more, my opinion, interesting dependence theory that's related to the increase of role of foreign multinational enterprises. And there was a study of multinational enterprises at this time, and Furtado was kind of developed these ideas in 1972 in a book. But if you see, you can find those same ideas in, for example, another development authors at this period of time. Of course, I'm not saying, well, trying to say we are not that original, but we are discussing at we are having thoughts and discussions and ideas at the same level, or the same ideas that were being discussed at the center, of course, in heterodox theory. It's important to mention too that Maria da Conceição Tavares, that was probably the most important author that introduced Kalecki in the discussion of growth for the economic miracle. She also was the person that introduced the Steindl model to understand development in Brazil in his thesis of 1973 or 1974. So we started to discuss not just effective demand, but growth models based on effective demand. We have Mário Poços, that after her was her student, developed a model of Kalecki, and she developed a model, not a model, but an interpretation based on Steindl, on his thesis. I think it was professor thesis. She has two theses, one for Unicamp, one for UFRJ. They are similar, but anyway, on these two theses, she uses the Steindl ideas, and this use of Steindl ideas and this traditional, they they are in the origin of the discussion that, for example, Franklin Serrano, a colleague of us at UFRJ, which also has this idea that that grew in the 90s of Kalekian's growth models, and we have the super multiplier model that has difference that are, of course, included in the same discussion. The Serafian's idea that have maybe, I'm not saying the origin, but they're discussed by Gariani when he wrote his classical article notes. He was discussing to growth, but was not very publicized because it was written in Italian. Anyway, and so you have the second line, second line of tradition. One I mentioned was inflation, and the second line is growth that started to this important change of Conceição Tavares and José Serra, incorporating collect ideas of effective man. Then Conceição Tavares incorporated Steiner models. They have this discussion in the beginning of the 90s of collection models, and some improvements, let's say improvements, but some changes made by Franklin and Faber and some colleagues here at the university that now are being discussed for heterodox authors in several countries. So you have the second line of continuity. So we can see this. I have to mention, because I'm not saying that's very original, but we also, besides this macro side, we have the micro side, the micro tendency. There are people that study at Sussex University in UK, and they came back to Brazil, and they thought my course of macro was very industrial organization course. So they translated the industrial organization theory to Brazilian ideas. They gave to us the backbone of we think in terms of microeconomics. So we have this third that, because I'm not a very, Gabriel should invited someone that's in the micro economics here at UFRJ.
That's true.
Because I don't have lugar de fala once again. But anyway, it's very important that we are at the cutting edge of the industrial organization model, and it was very important to avoid the traditional marginalist micro theory. So that was very important. What was at the same time developing here some ideas that were developed originally in UK. Anyway, it's just to mention that this important that you have. I'm finished. I have my 15 minutes. But this ideas that we have, that sometimes I want to mention, because for a lot of people it's some original idea of Brazil, is that the inertial. To have this idea in Brazil, I would say that inertial inflation. It's based on the fact, well known, that inertia is important, like the Phillips curve. But they have departing from this point of inertia, Phillips curve, and inflation and stabilization policies, they showed that particularly in the Brazilian case, the inertia was a huge, a very, very important element. And you have to try different policies, stabilization policies, because if you apply the conventional orthodox austerity policies, would be like a social disgrace without any good or strong result in economic terms. So in my opinion, they were very important, but they follow, once again, a tradition that began with Felipe Pazos. And it's very funny to say that the first guy to copy Felipe Pazos' ideas of inertial inflation was Mário Henrique Simonsen. Was a very orthodox guy, and some people that said, and it's true that Mário Henrique Simonsen, very orthodox author, shared these ideas of the importance of inertia in Brazilian inflation, that became, of course, much more important when inflation was at 200 a year, 300% a year. And we also imported some policy ideas that were put in place in the 20s in Germany and in other countries of the stabilization, creation of models. So they they borrow some ideas and put together a package, a more rational package in terms of stabilization, even though I don't think it's like original thought. Anyway, there's interesting case that explain something that it's related to Brazilian history or Brazilian particular historical conditions at this moment. And finally, just something we do stupid things too, not very creative, because I study at this moment. We have like a very, very bad, not our fault, I say, because I was in this, I'm old, so I'm part of history. So we have like a very not very well developed ideas about monetary policy and the relation between monetary policy and inflation in the 80s, and was very helpful that this discussion about endogenous money became much more important in the 90s. And today, thanks to MMT and modern and endogenous money theory, I think we settled to a more conventional theory that we accepted this, and something that we did not create, but now in Brazil, at least among heterodox authors, I think it's our orthodoxy within heterodoxy. So I guess, and something that we explore in our courses, in our work here in Brazil. So we have this transition from growth, I try to make very short presentation in inflation, monetary theory, and the one in micro theory that I just mentioned because it's not my field, but it was important, and we picked up from the ideas that were being presented in the UK and we adapted to Brazilian reality. I think that's the big picture. And
Brilliant.
19 minutes. Sorry, Gabriel.
That was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you. We were very flexible with time here, to be honest, and it was time well spent. A very good overview of the different contributions around Brazil and Latin America. I would say that how we function in these events, it works more or less like a research group, in the sense that we like to encourage open conversations and exchange of ideas, although with the benefit of having two very well qualified introductory remarks from our discussants and professors here today. I would like to ask if there is anyone who would like to pose a question or add a comment. Please either open your mic or raise your virtual hand, and we will call accordingly. If we don't have, or if you guys are thinking around the many topics covered, I'd just like to make one small comment, just for translation purposes. Carlos mentioned CEPAL, which is the name in Portuguese and Spanish. In English, I think it's ECLAC or ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America.
No, I don't know if you say ECLA or ECLA. How do you say in English? ECLA? No, it's ECLA, Economic Commission of Latin America. I know that's ECLA.
Caribbean,
And Caribbean.
Yeah.
But the native speakers say ECLA or ECLA. I don't know.
ECLA, I think.
ECLA.
There's a convention around that. ECLA sounds a bit too much like UCLA, so that's not.
Yes, let's say ECLA. ECLA with the E in Portuguese, ECLA.
Yeah, the Rio de Janeiro Portuguese in particular. But I was thinking, yeah, please.
Sorry, Gabriel. I'd like to take the opportunity to, as Andrew's here, so I think I was mentioned this heterodox tradition, and Andrew is one of the co-authors of a great book in which he and his colleagues interview a lot of heterodox economists. So not only from Brazil, I remember that you I don't know if you properly did this interview with Fernando Cardim from UFRJ, or it was Daniele, I don't know. But I think it's a great book, and I think it kind of illuminates some of the questions that we are dealing with here. And Andrew, do you think that Carlos more or less made an outline of the traditions in the Brazilian economic thought here and of UFRJ? And how do you see it in comparison to the other guys that you interview in that book? I know it's perhaps too much, but if you think there's one point or another that you could highlight for us on that differences, and also perhaps the similarities of this heterodox tradition.
Andrew, can I add a question to this one? I apologize. And I apologize because I'm conscious that you have a sore throat and wouldn't want to ask too much. But you mentioned the idea of power and how it's related to it's helping form heterodox thought or economic thought in general. But I had the impression, perhaps wrongly, that we, as economists, or the area of core economics, at least, it's very naive or tentatively trying to approach power in some cases, or at least it's treated as exogenous. Whereas we can see it evolving, for example, in the international political economy area or other related areas. So if you could just bear a couple of words where you see this idea is flourishing a little bit more recently, that would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that as well. I mean, in the paper we've got coming out, there are three things that are shared between, well, we think are common to that, to all our participants. One is a concern for realism or realisticness. Another is a concern for pluralism. And another is a concern about power. And as I said before, one of the key elements there was that heterodox economists saw that power was neglected. And as you say, a very sort of naive, exogenous market power scarcity type framework, but in no other terms. And it's very limited. Obviously, power is a complex concept. And if you go to political literature, there's all kinds of different definitions of what it is. We didn't really get into that. In fact, what we concluded was that there wasn't a great deal of agreement amongst our interviewees about what power does mean, but that it wasn't there enough, and yet it was something that they considered to be very important. So power in the economy, but also power within the academy. And now these, of course, as we point out in the paper, we deliberately didn't put it in the book because we wanted to have a separate paper, so it's purely instrumental, I confess. But in the paper, we do talk about how these people are not powerless. I mean, one of the things that some people say about heterodox economics or heterodox economists is that it's just a coalition of the powerless. It's just people who are complaining because they've been excluded. But actually, everyone we interviewed was a professor of economics or risen to a high position in government or something like that. So they've actually been successful, and they exercise their own power in their own ways to reach positions of influence. But they were still able to recognize that more broadly in the discipline, there's this big issue around, why did certain ideas become more popular or more prevalent than others? Well, it's not because they're better ideas, it's for other reasons. So this was very much a shared concern. So hopefully that's answered your question about Gabriel. To your question, Roberto, about the differences between Brazilian and the others, I mean, it's quite interesting and not that easy. I mean, both.
I know it's a tough question, but
yeah. I mean, one thing. I mean, I'm not going to suggest that Brazilian authors are all terribly derivative at all. But it is interesting, of course, that both of the people in the book had studied in the UK at length at Cambridge and UCL, and they were very heavily influenced by people like Victoria Chick. And so these networks, these opportunities for people to come from Brazil to study in the UK or the US are very important, and this can have these outcomes that you wouldn't necessarily have expected. And that's a journey that was shared by other people in the book, people who come from India or other places, which have obviously people in the UK and the US origin haven't done that. They're already in place. I don't think there was any. I think in line with what Carlos said, the kind of ideas that they were putting forward were had general application, but also had a sort of local specificity to them as well. And I think both of them did have a sense in that there was something slightly different about Brazilian economics. And when we think about the relationship between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, that's also different. It depends where you are. You know, the environment in Brazil has been a lot more open and friendly and pluralist and a lot more heterodox, and it raises the question about, well, what does heterodox mean in that context? It can't just be opposition to something or minority position. It's a distinct set of ideas, and that comes through quite clearly with those Brazilian authors. And they did get this sense that there was a sort of distinct thing called Brazilian economics, which did have an influence beyond that. And it's quite interesting, actually. I mean, this is not in the book, but when we were writing the paper about the educational systems, one of the people that was most critical of our view was actually David Dekesh, who said, no, you got this wrong. We've still got a very strong, distinct heterodox tradition in Brazil, and it's not under threat. International standing is important. This is good. It's not a threat. It's not something to be worried about. So he was quite resolute in defending the idea that there was this distinct thing called a Brazilian approach to economics, and that it had some strength. That's not something that we got from other people, perhaps, but I may be oversimplifying. Anyway.
Perfect. I think Thomas Pelly has a couple of papers about how he describes the economies as divided between different tribes, depending on how they raise their supply and curb demands. But just remind of the discussions. Actually, two couple interesting papers. And again, thank you for your comments, Andrew. Yes.
Just a quick comment, and also I'll leave for the chat. But when I was doing some research on what Andrew has published and so on, I saw a very interesting piece because you said, economists, which is economists, neither emperors nor dentists. But I would say, after all, the couple would like to hear what Andrew means for that. But anyway, then hand for the others.
I mean, I mean the short answer to that is that it responds to I mean, the idea of economic imperialism, as talked about by people like Ben Fine, that's not what we want economists to be. But on the other hand, we don't necessarily want economists to be, as Keynes put it, as humble as dentists who are just dealing with these tiny little practical problems. That they should still have big ideas, and they should still deal with big questions. They should just stop telling other people how to deal with them all. So neither the humble dentist nor the kind of imperialist economist that just tells everybody what to do. We seem to have lost Carlos.
Yes, I was gonna say this. I was sending the link for the meeting for him to reconnect. Just a second.
Is he back? No.
Roberto, você tem o telefone dele? Eu tô com problemas operacionais aqui. Obrigado. Sorry, guys. Technical issues. The perks of working from home.
It has been 3 years since the pandemics, and we still struggle. He will be joining us by phone. And Gary,
Yeah, I have a comment, but I want to wait for Carlos to get his reaction because I want to expand on the importance of CEPAL, or actually I call it ECLAC, which is even worse.
There you go. Yeah.
ECLA.
he'll be connecting by phone. I already sent him the link, so in a second he'll be with us again. Yeah.
Is he back? Carlos.
Think so. Yeah, he's still connecting.
He's not hearing.
Yeah, okay, now you hear. Now you're hearing?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. So let's continue. Gary, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Carlos, waiting for you. I wanted to make a comment expanding on or taking off from your discourse. David de Keshan tradition. What I want to propose is that, say, Paul,
Is it only me or is Gary?
No,
connection?
it's Gary's connection now.
I think he's gone, yeah. Oh my God.
We've had a share of technical issues in this series of events. I guess by now we're veterans.
No,
Yeah.
I will
Can I say
organize.
something that I was,
Yeah,
since I was,
Yes.
I didn't.
Please,
No,
please.
just to mention three things that since I tried in 15 minutes to tell such a large story, I forgot the Herald was San Multiply, and the book of Herald is called International Economics, and there is this idea that Prebisch might have read this book to has this idea of standard constraint as something important and something like the theory law similar. So that's the first one. The second one, that I when I said the effective demand tradition, of course, I in this large group I put the post-Keynesian tradition. They have some originality. They focus more on the question of financial markets. Norbert Peers, specialists on this. Anyway, but I did not enter in the details of the broad family that I call the effective demand family, that in Brazil, I think that initiated by the influence of Kalec, and then became some kind of tradition of heterodox authors. And I think that you have to have effective demand oriented economies to be heterodox. For me, it's the definition of heterodoxy is against the equilibrium of marginalist equilibrium of supply and demand, and adopt effective demand in short and long term. That's my second point, that it's a big family, that you have contributions from people that comes from post-Keynesian approach more clearly. And the third that I didn't mention, that's important too, at this growth model, people that working with growth model that derives from this traditional Steindl Kalec, there is also a very important influence for theory, which is called theory models of external constraint. That's important. It's also a lot of people working in FMG, for example, Federal Minas Gerais, and even here in UFRJ, we are discussing the influence of financial flows and external debt to the external the theoretical external law is relaxed or still it holds when you put financial markets and the financial flows and debt and external debt. So it's a discussion also that this I mentioned the big group of growth models, heterodox growth models. I want to make these three clarifications not to be more superficial than I was.
Perfect. It's a big thanks. Thank you, Carlos. Gary, you have your.
Yeah, thanks. Carlos, thanks for the elaboration. And I moved position, so I'm closer to a good source. I wanted to expand on your, to take off from your pointing to the importance of CEPAL, of ECLA, and argue that the discourse in the history of economic thought and its evolution in Latin America, as I participated on the margin, is we very much see CEPAL in the idea of structuralism and dependency, or the questions of center periphery at the center. And something remarkable to me is that if we look at, for example, the different approaches that we see, let's start with David Dekesh. He's over at Unicampi, where we have a strong influence of the French regulationist approach. And if we then think of Karjim's impact on UFRJ with the monetary macro approach and bringing in some of those, monetary and post-Keynesian ideas. And then if we think of, how about Franklin Serrano and, the kind of super multiplier and kind of the input-output and a kind of a neo-Ricardian. And of course, we can think of colleagues too that are taking this in more of a Marxian direction. But what I would argue is that a kind of, regardless of whether the colleagues are thinking of themselves as Marxian or post-Keynesian or even structuralist, and that what I might add, Carlos, to your depiction of aggregate demand, external constraints, I think that's one reason why we see, for example, some of the ideas that, say at UFRJ, the idea of external constraints and the different models coming from Cambridge. But this center periphery thinking and the need to keep that in mind seems to be something that allows discourse across some of these paradigmatic lines. Now, by contrast, to go to the question of the seminar, I don't see that so much in outside, let's say in England. I do have a question for Andrew, because having worked for many years in the US, leaving aside the heterodox economists there, to me, a big characteristic of the US is a denial of anything like the history of economic thought. When I taught around mainstream colleagues in the US, a common thing was, advice was, don't read anything older than 10 years ago. So we have people, now doing DSGE models. Well, 20 years ago, maybe they were doing real business cycle models. 10 years before that, they were doing the overlapping generations models. And 10 years before that, they were playing games like Barrow and so on, putting rational expectations into Keynesian models and blowing them up. Now, if we were to use overlapping generations and submit that to a mainstream journal, we'd get nowhere in the US. But so one thing is, I think for the mainstream, there's a denial of history, which makes those of us who work in heterodox traditions, we always get that card that you all are just working on the history of economic thought. You're not really doing economics, because economics is DSGE or whatever it might be. But going for a minute then to the heterodox community, and specifically the post-Keynesian, I would just note that at the minute, we have a lot of people who are working with stock flow consistent modeling. And I don't know if we have any, I don't think we have proponents of SFC modeling on the call, but my comment would be stock flow consistent modeling is a portfolio equilibrium model in which we introduce some macro, aspects in a very limited way. But we're basically working off of a model that was developed inside a tradition of that combined sort of some structural Keynesian ideas with portfolio equilibrium ideas, and it sort of starts and stops there. Now, when you just put in simple assumptions taken from the simplest views of Kalecki, then you can argue that it's a Kaleckian model, and then you have these debates about wage-led growth and profit-led growth. But if I can speak out of school for a minute, but to me, it leads to a very simplistic dialogue about, like look at, for example, our colleagues at Greenwich have sort of made an effort to examine economies across the world to say if they're wage-led or profit-led. There's no recognition of the importance of structuralist features, of the fact that, say with Thirlwall's law is not something that we hear. We see Brazilians bringing it back from Cambridge and Tony Thirlwall back to Brazil and so on, back to Argentina. But we don't see that as a current discourse in, say, the CJE or other places, other than Brazilian authors and Latin Americans publishing Thirlwall's law articles about, within those journals. But we're not seeing European economists take up those issues. So I think that there's something very precious about, say, Powell as something that somehow, even after all these years, is a kind of unifying force that forces you to keep in mind the center-periphery dimension that has to be there if you're going to make anything that people will recognize as an economic model, especially macroeconomic model of a Latin American context. And I think that we've lost that, or that doesn't exist in the EU or in Britain, or and then in the US. Look at, I appreciate what you said, Carlos, about MMT, but MMT is basically something that in the core says, if you just get the economic policies right and use government for the right purpose, basically you can solve your economic problems, capitalist crisis or not. It reminds me of a precious moment sitting next to Karjim when we were watching Warren Mosler for the first time address the post-Keynesian meeting. And, Karjim and I would always sit together as best friends and just kibitz together. And he leaned over to me, and as Warren was going on about MMT, and said, "We can never invite these people to Brazil." Now, it's happened, but I'll stop there. Just some comments.
That was brilliant. That was brilliant, Gary. I was thinking that I have to get some bits of it and add to the discussion of my thesis. Another part of Gary's contributions come from his ideas, and they're always very helpful. I don't know if Carlos or Andrew would like to echo the comments first.
Well, my mic is open.
Yes.
Okay. So now I agree 100% with Gary. What Gary said, that the CEPAL or ECLA traditional heritage of the idea of center periphery is a very important one for us for heterodox also, and that's an interesting thing. When the Unicamp school, that was the heir of the ECLA's tradition, they wrote what they presented the interpretation of Brazil's economy in the 70s, a series of books and theses. They tend to diminish, to reduce the importance of external constraint, because we have so much financial flows and external investment of firms of multinationals in Brazil. So they thought that this problem would be less relevant than it was before the 60s. And then came that crisis in the 80s, and we learned that we haven't overcome this problem of external constraint, and we have the 90s crisis, and something that, and we learned that we need to increase exports in order to have this, to overcome, or at least to increase the level of output is compatible with external equilibrium defined somehow. So I think that it's something that's important, and maybe more important than just models, I guess. It was the basic idea that we are a peripheral country and to have some hierarchy of countries and have some limitations. And said that, I would like to say that I was one of the responsible for MMT in Brazil, so you have to blame someone. Put the blame on me. The first article written in Brazil
It was you.
review. I shouldn't have come back to Brazil from my PhD in the school. But anyway, the first article was a review on the Ray's book. That was the first book written. And to me, I'm not an MMT author or something. I think MMT is important for fiscal policy. It clarifies a lot of things in terms of monetary policy, of the link between a government financing and monetary policy. However, I agree 100% that it's very, very poor in terms of the way they deal with the external constraint. And they are Americans. If I should be an American, I don't care. External constraint. I can print as much debt or as much dollars that I want. So I don't have the thing. So I understand. And they are not very, like, how could I say, developed, or they didn't have a good theory of inflation. Of course, they don't have. The model doesn't. They might have some kind of a conflict of Marxist conflict of income or distributive conflict, but they don't have. So I think to be called an MMT author is something that I don't do myself. I think they are useful. They brought useful ideas in terms of financial, of public finance ideas. They clarify a lot of things that I have problems. I'm saying because I want to suffer from this. The dimension that I was when I tried to write my, just a personal note, my not say that my PhD dissertation was very good, but my master's dissertation was a disaster because I started my dissertation, have an idea, and in the middle I thought that I was completely wrong, and I have to turn something out to the committee. So I have to patch some parts of my work and do not defend. Because the idea that our inflation, hyperinflation, was not based on the distributive conflict model. So I learned that. And of course, I agree 100% with you. If you follow like MMT to the letter, be an MMT economist, you miss something that's maybe our DNA, which is the idea that we are peripheral countries, that a hierarchy of countries, you have financial problems. Being a peripheral country, you have not the same financial insertion that the other countries have. You cannot compare Australia and Brazil. Australia is part of the UK. The Queen is the so they will get much more financial flows easily than we are peripheral countries. It happened to Argentina in the 19th century when they were very rich, and they have external crisis in 1990, the Barry houses. So we understand that. Of course, I guess the people from it doesn't understand that, and I understand why they don't understand, because they are Americans, and we try to keep our DNA in terms of this very important element, as you mentioned, the whole idea that a peripheral country have limitation, we have external constraint, not just trade, this external constraint, but most importantly, the financial external constraint. So I agree with you.
Andrew, please.
Yeah, just to respond to Gary's points about well, there are a couple of things. I guess one about the history of thought and what role it actually plays in people's thinking. I agree. I think there's been a reluctance to talk about that, and a reluctance to talk about methodology as well, because they're awkward areas for for lots of people, particularly for mainstream economists. I'd still say that there's an implicit history there that's embedded and they've internalized, part of which is that it's not that important. But if you were to ask them what I mean, the strand that runs through all those different developments that you talked about was a mathematical approach, particular. So maybe we're talking about method rather than, or methodological principles rather than particular methods, or even particular theoretical principles. Although I do think, some of those theoretical principles run through, like, behavioral economics, there's still that rational utility maximizer sitting in the back of them as this kind of ideal standard, and if only they behave properly, then things would be okay. But we know that they don't, so let's talk about that. So, but it's still there. So there's kind of all these implicit things that are absolutely there, but we don't have to think about them because they've just been embedded and internalized. So, but I would agree. I mean, there's even in a very quick anecdote. In 2009, at the last ASA conference I went to in San Francisco, and I hate them, so that's why I've not been back. But I was in a session on great teaching, and somebody asked the question, shouldn't we be teaching, we've given all this global financial crisis, shouldn't we be teaching more Marx or Keynes or Minsky and people like that? And one of the panelists said, no, I don't think we should allow a once in a 75-year event to change what we teach. Which I was so gobsmacked that I didn't say anything. I really wish I could transport myself back there and sort of say, what the hell are you, this was a session about great teaching. This was one of the most anti-educational things I've ever heard. But there was very much a reluctance to engage with these other traditions, but even to engage with events, because it's not convenient. We all know that academic research is hard, and that its power is given up very, 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 very seldom. And that if you try and start examining these alternative traditions, you run the risk of actually undermining your own position. So there's no reason to do that. So I think there's a whole bunch of things there about institutional structures and how people are hired and various other things that reinforce that reluctance to talk about these things. The other thing I wanted to say was that obviously in my opening, I oversimplified tremendously and offered a fairly deterministic account. And I certainly accept that local contexts and local events can play a big role in driving economic thought and economic research and activity for quite a long time. And I wouldn't want to say that the periphery is always at the sort of the mercy of the core. There are dynamics there and we don't know how those are going to play out. And maybe the quest for international standing within Brazilian academia could be a good thing. I mean, it could mean that those ideas that are being developed in Brazil do get amplified in a way that we don't expect, or it's a way of them becoming further marginalized or further excluded. I don't know. It's very much an open question. So I wouldn't want to suggest that it's all one way or it's all settled or anything like that.
Please, Gary.
Just a quick comment on the difference. Actually, in Brazil, the CNPq, the academic group that awards stars or rankings to journals, includes journals that are discounted here, like the JPKE and so on. And I wonder if that does have something to do with the continuing importance of these ideas of structuralism, difference, constraints, and so on, that in some sense we could never imagine that happening in the UK. But just a story that's even just as bad as the one you had. John Driffel reports on a meeting of the Royal Economic Society in 2009. They were debating the Queen's negative reaction to the economic crisis and what went wrong with macro. And one of the main proponents of that DSGE model said the following thing. He said, well, you cannot blame us, the DSGE model, for the financial crisis because there's no money in our model. There's no financial sector. You can't blame us. It's not there. Good answer.
That would be tough to reply. Andrew.
No, I think the point about journals is very interesting. Obviously, even in the UK, and when I mentioned this when I talked about economists moving to business schools, one of the reasons economists move to business schools is that because of the Association of Business Schools journal ranking list is actually quite a lot more permissive than the economics ones. So we have colleagues who published in journals like Sociology or Work Employment Society or Environment Planning, which are journals that are in the sort of top ranked Association of Business Schools lists, but are not in the traditional economics. So these lists are incredibly important. I suppose the question for Brazil is to what extent this pressure to sort of recognize international journals of international standing means that the sort of local journals or the journals discussing topics that are important locally remain important, or whether they get squeezed out. And that's the threat. I mean, it could go in the other direction, but that to me, that's the threat.
I don't know if Carlos or even Norberto would like to echo some thoughts about this comment.
Yeah, no, I think I will save your time talking about how we did the last qualis, which is more or less the ranking that we use as a reference, but because it was really difficult and I think there is some politics, but I think one thing that we were able to achieve, it was to recognize that different areas of economic thinking have different profiles of publications, and then we are able to. We never had doing a bad parallel, but we never had a Brazilian journal that was ranked as a 5-star in our standards. It's not very comparable, but just to let you know more or less, we never had a 5-star. We only had a 4-star Brazilian journal. So in the last ranking, we are able to, by recognizing the areas according to the GEL classification. So we ranked the top journals in each of the GEL more, how to speak, aggregate classification. So the letters, not the sub letters, but the letters. So have history of economic thought. Okay, which are the journals who are better positioned for people that publish in history of economic thought? And then we are able to do this using impact factors. This is unavoidable, but we're able to do this. And then finally now we have 5 stars Brazilian journals. And we have this point, I think, which is more relevant in this political struggle, which is to recognize that people who publish and do research in Brazilian economics, or in the economic history of Brazil, they for sure they will not be publishing the American Economic Review. That's one thing. It's impossible. It's not even one cannot conceive this. But you can have a really good journal, or you can publish perhaps at the Revista de la CEPAL or something that has an international audience, but also you are able to acknowledge that you have some specificities in each area. So our qualities are ranking get a lot better for us who are heterodox economists in the last 4 years. But it has been a tough political struggle inside the area, and if we had a coffee, I'll be happy to share the details. But as we are recording, I'll stop here.
first-hand experience there. Carlos, Pinkus, as we say, would you like to echo any thoughts from the last comments?
Oh, the last comments that I hope that there was inertia also, and that's something that's just to mention that maybe people that doesn't know the history of Brazil economies, that's something original that happened in Brazil in the 80s. The dictatorship was developmentalist. That's something interesting, and the policies were like managed. Well, the responsible for the policy was conventional guys, rightist guys, right-wing oriented guys, but they are not entirely orthodox in terms of, or if they were like Maria Henrique Simas, when they were in power, they didn't have problems to put in place a very heterodox somehow, let's say, policies. So that's the first point. That's complicated, makes things more complicated in Brazil, because at least we didn't have this direct connection between like orthodox institutions and orthodox policies. Now we have this. Now we have like schools that are pretty much mainstreams that want to put in place mainstream policies. They're very radical. They say we are just stupid. We don't know anything. They don't know math. We don't know theory. Just like people that invented that there was an alternative theory and keep saying that. Okay, so now we are more homogeneous in terms of the ideas and the authors, and we didn't have this in the 60s and the 70s. And then in the 70s, at the period, a very influential school of thought, Unicamp, as a university that still is very important, became those authors, the economists there, became very close to important capitalists that were against the dictatorship. So it's complicated because we have this alliance, political alliance, which is not entirely theoretical, but it gave some, how could I say, strength of heterodoxy within the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class, of capitalists, you name it, of managers, like in the US, they like to say. So it's a little bit more complicated. I think it gave us some leverage. It gave us more time to survive. Besides the power play that happens, as Bob said, he cannot mention that things that happen below the curtain, behind the curtains, and that it's important for us to fight for positions, grants, and the ratings of publication. That's a political, but it's a little bit more complicated. I hope it is for good and bad. This association of heterodox authors with the São Paulo bourgeoisie, it has some problems also. It's not that free of problems, but I guess it makes the picture a little bit more complicated. It was very strange in the 70s and 60s. We have developmentalist policies put in place by orthodox authors in general. Let's see, Delfinet is nothing. It could be orthodox, heterodox, and anyway, he just wants to be in power. It's a different type of guy. But anyway, today, I think it's more organized, let's say, that you have like the schools, and even when we have the end of the dictatorship, for example, the people from PUC, the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, they were not entirely, they were the old MIT. They go to Harvard, they go to old MIT. And for example, that's funny. One guy that's a crazy liberal now, Gustavo Franco, is exactly the same guy that wrote an important article published in the Journal of History, of Historical History. I don't know. No, the Journal of History of Journal of History Economics. I think that's Economic History, Journal of Economic History. Yes, one paper criticized Sargent model about the end of big inflation. So this guy that today is the most crazy liberal Austrian guy was the one that in 1987 wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of Economic History criticizing Sargent theory about the end of our big inflations. So even in the 80s, the thing was less clear. So the polarization between like conservatives and right wings and more orthodox ideas and more progressive and heterodox ideas became more clear in the 90s, and the confusion maybe that they have in the 80s, I hope it still has a kind of inertia and this political force or political position that we can still have here in Brazil to keep the heterodox tradition alive. That's just to clarify people that doesn't know the confusion around politics and theory and universities in Brazil. A little bit more complicated. Now it's very clear. It's not complicated. I wouldn't say thank God because it's worse for us, but at least it's easier to explain.
That was brilliant and a very quick summary of a long history, I'd say, in our cases.
As any quick summary is awful, but anyway, I'll try.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. And I would just like, we exceeded our time a little bit, so I would like to wrap up on, at least on my end, and thank again both discussants, Andrew Mearman and Carlos Pinkusfeld. There was an excellent talk. I, for one, was super engaged in it and learned a lot, thought a lot about what we are doing. And I'd like to thank you and thank everyone for keeping with us. This will be the second to last Rio and Leeds Bridge seminar. We will schedule the last one. Should be by the end of November, but we have to confirm the date. And it will approach matters of labor economics and a little bit of productive specialization. But I'd just like to thank everyone. It's been an excellent conversation. I don't know if Norberto would like to say a few words, Bianca as well, but nope. Okay. Thank you all very much. Have a good Friday, good weekend ahead.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Pinkus.